Angela Williams stepped into the crowded courtroom, her heels clicking softly against the smooth floor. She was dressed in a smart blazer and dark jeans, her hair pulled back into a neat bun, an image of professionalism that matched her role as a rising star in Washington, D.C. As one of the youngest federal policy strategists, Angela was used to navigating high-stakes meetings and complex legislative debates. But today, she was here for something far less glamorous, a simple parking violation. Her car had been towed earlier in the week while she was in the middle of an urgent policy briefing. Caught up in the rush of work, she had parked in a restricted area without a second thought. She knew it was her mistake, but it wasn't something that had ever crossed her mind before. Normally, Angela worked in rooms full of senators, policy advisors, and lobbyists, people who debated issues with weighty consequences. A parking ticket felt almost trivial by comparison. She looked around the courtroom, filled with people waiting for their own turn before Judge Robert Carter. The atmosphere was sterile, almost cold, with a few murmured conversations and the hum of paper shuffling. Angela, trying not to seem out of place, took a seat in the front row, waiting for her name to be called. Her mind, though, was far from the courtroom. She had a meeting scheduled in an hour, and she couldn't afford to miss it. Finally, the clerk called her name. She stood and made her way to the front, standing before Judge Carter, who had already fixed his gaze on her. Judge Carter was a middle-aged man with sharp features and a reputation for being no-nonsense. He had seen hundreds of cases like this, people caught in the small messes of life, with minor violations that rarely merited more than a brief reprimand. But today, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that something about this encounter was going to be different. "Ms. Williams," Judge Carter said, his voice booming in the otherwise quiet room, "you've been cited for parking in a restricted zone. It's quite clear from the evidence that your actions were in violation of city regulations. Do you have any reason for this?" Angela took a deep breath. She wasn't here to argue the fine, but she did feel the need to explain. "Your Honor, I understand the citation. I was caught up in a family emergency, and when I returned, my car was gone. I didn't realize it was in a restricted area. I'd be happy to pay the fine, but I would appreciate any leniency, given the circumstances." Judge Carter barely blinked as he listened, his expression unreadable. He glanced at the paperwork in front of him, then back at Angela. "Your explanation doesn't change the fact that the law was broken." "The fine stands," he said, his voice firm. Angela's heart sank. It wasn't the fine that bothered her. It was the way the judge dismissed her without much thought. She had tried to explain, but it seemed as if her words held no weight. This wasn't about the violation anymore. It was about the principle of being heard, of being treated fairly. She nodded, accepting the decision without protest. But as she left the courtroom, a feeling of unease began to settle in her chest. Angela walked out of the courtroom, her mind swirling. She had expected a simple resolution, but instead, she felt as though she had been reduced to just another name on a list of minor violations, her explanation swept aside as if it didn't matter. The brief encounter with Judge Carter had left a sour taste in her mouth, one that lingered longer than the fine itself. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her back to reality. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a reminder for her next meeting. A strategic session with senior policymakers in Washington, D.C. She'd been looking forward to this meeting all week, knowing the policy initiative she was working on had the potential to impact millions of lives. She had to put this frustrating moment behind her. Angela stepped outside the courthouse, her thoughts still clouded by the way she had been treated. As she made her way toward the parking lot, she was aware of the bustling activity around her, people coming and going, each absorbed in their own world. But there was a tension in the air now, something she couldn't shake. She could feel the weight of Judge Carter's indifference hanging over her, and it left her unsettled. Before she could get into her car, her phone rang. It was a colleague from D.C. calling to discuss the meeting she was about to attend. Angela answered quickly, trying to keep her focus on the conversation. But her mind kept drifting back to the courtroom. She hadn't expected such a cold response from the judge, especially after explaining herself. As she spoke to her colleague about the new policy proposal, the world around her seemed to slow down. She was no longer just the woman who had been fined for a parking ticket. She was Angela Williams, the youngest federal policy strategist in the country, a woman who had worked tirelessly to shape national policy and had earned the respect of some of the most influential leaders in government. Yet here, in this small, forgotten courtroom, she was nothing more than a name on a docket. In the middle of the conversation, she heard a soft voice behind her. "Excuse me, Ms. Williams." Angela turned to see a young woman, the courthouse clerk, standing a few feet away. The clerk had overheard part of her phone call, and Angela could see the recognition in her eyes. "I didn't mean to interrupt," the clerk said. "But you're Angela Williams, right? The policy strategist from D.C." Angela's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected anyone here to know who she was, and for a brief moment, she wondered if the clerk was about to make her feel even more out of place. "Yes, that's me," Angela said cautiously, raising an eyebrow. The clerk hesitated, then took a step closer. "I just wanted to say, I didn't realize who you were. I overheard your conversation. It's incredible what you do. I'm sorry about the fine. It doesn't seem right, given who you are." Angela paused, taken aback by the clerk's words. The clerk seemed genuinely sympathetic, and for a brief moment, Angela felt a flicker of validation. It wasn't the fine that bothered her, but the dismissiveness, the assumption that she was just another face in a long line of cases. "Thank you," Angela replied, offering a tight smile. "I appreciate that." As she hung up with her colleague and started dragging off, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. She had been treated like just another person in a system, when in reality, her role was far more significant. She knew this wasn't over. As Angela drove through the city streets, she felt the weight of the day's events pressing down on her. The fine, the dismissive tone of the judge, and now the awkward encounter with the clerk had all left her unsettled. She had been dismissed by a system that didn't know her, and that stung more than any ticket ever could. Angela was used to being heard, respected for her expertise, but in that courtroom, she had felt invisible. She tried to shake it off, telling herself that it was just a minor setback. After all, she had important work waiting for her in Washington. She had bigger battles to fight, ones that would impact policy on a national scale. Yet the feeling of being reduced to nothing more than a name on a docket lingered. As Angela turned onto the highway and headed toward the airport, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from her assistant, reminding her about the policy meeting she was about to attend. She glanced down at the screen, her thumb hovering over the message. It was then that she noticed something strange, a missed call. From a number she didn't recognize. Curiosity tugged at her, and she quickly dialed the number back. "Hello," a voice answered on the other end, a woman's voice, calm and professional. "Hi, this is Angela Williams. I missed your call," Angela said, her tone polite but curious. The woman introduced herself as Sarah Thompson, a clerk at the courthouse where Angela had just appeared before Judge Carter. Angela felt a moment of surprise and hesitation. What could this clerk possibly want? "I know this is probably unexpected, but I couldn't help overhearing your phone call when you were outside the courtroom earlier," Sarah began. "I just wanted to apologize for the way things went down in there." Angela's brow furrowed. "Apologize? I'm not sure what you mean," she replied, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "I overheard you talking about your role in federal policy, and well, it caught me off guard," Sarah continued. "I didn't realize who you were. You're one of the youngest federal policy strategists in the country, right?" Angela nodded slowly, even though Sarah couldn't see her. "Yes, that's correct. But why does that matter? It was a simple parking ticket. I just wanted to say that I don't think you should have been treated the way you were. You deserve more respect, and I'm sorry if Judge Carter's handling of the situation made you feel less than you are," Sarah said, her voice softening. "It doesn't sit right with me, and I wanted you to know that." Angela was taken aback. It wasn't every day that someone, especially a stranger, took the time to acknowledge her worth and apologize for something that wasn't even directly their fault. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft. "I appreciate that more than you know. It's just frustrating. I've spent my life working to make an impact, and then in a moment like this, it feels like none of that matters." "I understand," Sarah replied. "I just wanted to make sure you knew that not everyone sees you the way Judge Carter did." The conversation ended, but Angela was left with more questions than answers. The clerk's words had struck a chord, and for the first time since leaving the courtroom, Angela began to wonder if her experience had been more than just an unfortunate coincidence. Was it possible that her identity as a young black woman in a powerful role had influenced how she was treated? Or was it just a matter of a busy judge making a snap decision? She shook her head, not sure if it was worth dissecting further. But one thing was clear: this wasn't the end of the story. The next morning, Sarah Thompson couldn't shake the conversation she had with Angela. She had gone home that evening thinking about the powerful young woman she'd overheard on the phone. Someone who had achieved so much at such a young age, yet had been treated like just another minor violation in the courthouse. Something about it didn't sit right with her. Angela's calm demeanor, the way she carried herself despite the judge's dismissive tone, stuck with Sarah. It was hard to reconcile the confident, capable woman she had heard speak on the phone with the way she had been brushed aside in court. Sarah sat at her desk, her fingers drumming nervously on the surface as she recalled the scene from the day before. She couldn't stop thinking about how the judge had swiftly handed down the fine, barely acknowledging Angela's explanation. Sarah had seen this happen countless times, but something was different with Angela. She didn't just look like an average citizen. She was a woman of influence, someone whose work shaped national policy, and yet she had been treated like any other defendant. That bothered Sarah more than she cared to admit. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from a colleague, Mike, a lawyer who often handled cases in the same courthouse. He was well acquainted with Judge Carter, and Sarah couldn't help but feel a twinge of nervousness as she read his message. "Did you see the woman from yesterday's hearing? Turns out she's the youngest federal policy strategist in the country. I heard she's a big deal in D.C. The realization hit Sarah hard. She had been right. Angela was someone important. Mike's message confirmed it. And suddenly, everything made sense. How could someone of Angela's caliber be treated like a faceless person who simply broke the law? It felt wrong, almost unfair. Sarah's unease grew. She began to feel a responsibility to right the wrong she had witnessed, even though she wasn't sure what could be done. She paused before typing a quick reply. "I overheard her talking on the phone outside the courtroom. She's amazing. Definitely not someone who should have been dismissed like that. I think Carter might have jumped to conclusions." Mike's response was quick, almost too quick. No surprise there. He's known for being a bit hasty. But that's his style. "I don't know, though. Maybe he needs to hear it from someone else." Sarah hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. What exactly did she want from Mike? She couldn't explain it, but she felt a strange need to make Angela's situation known, to make it clear that the system had failed her, even if only for a brief moment. After all, the very core of the system was supposed to be about fairness, right? She put her phone down, letting out a sigh. She knew she couldn't leave this alone. Whether Angela realized it or not, she had stirred something in Sarah, a desire to make things right. The next morning, she found herself discussing the case with a few other colleagues in the courthouse break room. Carefully choosing her words, Sarah wasn't sure what she hoped to achieve, but she couldn't ignore what was clearly bothering her. The more she talked, the more the idea of reaching out to Judge Carter lingered in the back of her mind. Would it be possible to approach him? Would he even listen to someone like her? In the end, Sarah made up her mind. It was time to speak up. Angela's story needed to be heard, and someone in that courthouse needed to make sure it didn't go unnoticed. Judge Robert Carter sat in his chambers, the faint hum of the courthouse outside barely breaking the silence. His desk, usually cluttered with case files, was now almost meticulously organized, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts racing through his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about Angela Williams, the young woman he'd dismissed so quickly the day before, her explanation unheard, her situation dismissed as just another trivial violation. Now, in the quiet of his office, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone wrong. It wasn't the first time he had dealt with a minor offense, of course. Parking violations, speeding tickets, small claims. He had seen them all. In his many years on the bench, Carter had grown accustomed to making quick judgments. Efficiency was key in a court that saw dozens of cases a day. The people who came before him were often just names, cases to be processed, rather than individuals with unique stories or challenges. He'd long prided himself on being decisive, on not letting emotions cloud his judgment. It was a system that worked for him, until now. The problem wasn't just Angela's case. It was the nagging feeling that he hadn't given her the time she deserved. He had been abrupt, sure, but it wasn't just that. There was something about the way she had stood there, so composed, so professional, that had left him with the distinct sense that he hadn't done right by her. And now, as he replayed the interaction in his mind, he realized he had made a mistake. He hadn't even thought to ask her more about her situation. He hadn't bothered to listen. The idea of someone like Angela, so young and accomplished, being treated so dismissively didn't sit well with him. It wasn't just the fact that she was a federal policy strategist, though that was certainly striking. It was the way her presence in the courtroom had made him feel, a subtle reminder that there were people out there, working tirelessly to influence the very laws he helped enforce. People like Angela were trying to make real, meaningful change, and here he was, caught in his own routine, overlooking her as just another defendant. A knot tightened in his stomach. Was this what the system had become? A place where important, influential people were treated the same as anyone else, only to be ignored or dismissed by a judge who was too quick to make up his mind. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his career believing in fairness, in equal treatment under the law. But had he really been fair? His hand reached for the phone, almost instinctively. He wasn't sure what he was going to say, but he knew he couldn't just let it go. He needed to speak with Angela, to offer her something more than a cold dismissal. It was the least he could do. The phone rang, and after a few moments, he heard her voice on the other end. "Ms. Williams," he began, his voice more hesitant than he intended. "This is Judge Carter. I wanted to speak with you about your case." Angela paused for a moment, and for the first time, Carter felt the weight of the situation. He wasn't used to feeling uncertain about his decisions, but this was different. "Please," he continued, "if you have a moment, I'd like to apologize for how I handled things yesterday. I didn't take your explanation into account the way I should have. And for that, I'm truly sorry." Angela had been sitting in her office in Washington, still processing the whirlwind of events from the past couple of days. She had barely slept, her mind preoccupied by the frustrating encounter with Judge Carter and the way the court session had unfolded. She couldn't shake the feeling that the experience had somehow been a microcosm of something bigger, a reflection of how people like her, young black women in high-powered roles, were often overlooked or underestimated. Her phone buzzed, startling her from her thoughts. When she saw the caller ID, she felt a brief flicker of surprise. Judge Robert Carter. She hesitated for a moment. What could he possibly want? She had already written the incident off, convinced that it was just an unfortunate moment. But as the phone continued to ring, something told her to pick it up. "Hello," Angela answered, her tone cautious but polite. "Ms. Williams, this is Judge Carter," came the voice on the other end, sounding more tentative than Angela expected. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I wanted to speak with you about your case from the other day. Do you have a moment?" Angela blinked, unsure how to respond. The last thing she had expected was for the judge to reach out to her, especially not with an apology. I'm listening," she said, still unsure of where this conversation was headed. There was a pause on the line before Judge Carter spoke again, his voice tinged with sincerity. "I've been thinking a lot about how I handled your case, and I've come to the conclusion that I was too quick to judge. I didn't take the time to hear you out, and I deeply regret that. Your explanation was valid, and you deserve more respect than I gave you." Angela felt a ripple of surprise, followed by a quiet wave of relief. She hadn't expected an apology, certainly not one that came so directly from the judge himself. In that moment, she realized that this wasn't just about a parking ticket anymore. It was about something larger, something that transcended the boundaries of the courthouse. "I appreciate your words, Judge Carter," Angela replied, her voice steady but genuine. "I have to admit, I wasn't expecting this call, but it means a lot to me that you reached out." The judge's tone softened further. "I've been thinking about it, and I realized I made an assumption about you, about who you are. And that assumption was wrong. I should have treated you with more respect, and I can only hope that you understand it wasn't a reflection of your worth, but of my own lapse in judgment." Angela felt a brief flash of discomfort. The apology was thoughtful, but it also highlighted just how easily someone like her could be overlooked. She had spent years earning the respect of her colleagues in D.C., and yet here she was, standing before a judge who had never considered her a person of significance. The realization wasn't lost on her. "Thank you, Judge Carter," she said after a pause. "I understand that we all make mistakes. I appreciate that you took the time to reflect on this, and I'm glad we could have this conversation." There was a brief silence before Judge Carter spoke again. "I also wanted to ask, would you be willing to meet in person? I would love to have a conversation with you about your work, and perhaps even learn more about the policies you're involved in." Angela took a deep breath, considering his request. This wasn't just a chance to have a conversation. It was an opportunity to help bridge the gap between the world of policy and the justice system. "I'd be happy to," Angela said, a small smile forming on her face. "Let's set something up." As they ended the call, Angela felt a shift. It wasn't just the resolution of her case that had changed. It was the recognition of something deeper. The possibility of understanding and respect between two people who had, for a brief moment, been on opposite sides of a system that could be far more compassionate than it often showed. A few days later, Angela met Judge Carter in a small cafe near the courthouse. She wasn't sure what to expect, but she had agreed to the meeting out of curiosity, as well as a sense that this conversation might hold more significance than she originally realized. The judge had apologized, and Angela had accepted his words, but this felt like an opportunity to go beyond the apology and dive into something deeper, the complexities of the system they both operated in, and the role people like her played in shaping it. As she entered the cafe, she spotted him immediately. Judge Carter was sitting at a corner table, a cup of coffee in front of him. He had a thoughtful look on his face, as though he were preparing for something important. Angela approached and extended her hand, and he stood to greet her, his expression genuine. "Ms. Williams, thank you for taking the time to meet with me," he said, offering her a warm smile. "It's no problem, Judge Carter," Angela replied as she sat down. She noticed that there was a slight shift in his posture compared to their first meeting. There was no longer any formality or authority in his stance, just two people sitting down for a conversation. For a few moments, they simply exchanged pleasantries about the weather, the cafe's atmosphere, and other small talk, but Angela quickly realized that both of them were eager to get to the heart of the matter. Finally, the judge broke the silence. "I've spent a lot of time thinking about our interaction in court. I've been a judge for nearly 2 decades, and I've seen it all. Cases like yours happen every day. But I've never had someone come before me who made me stop and think about the broader implications of how the system works. You're not just someone who shows up in court. You're someone who's actively shaping the future of this country. And that matters." Angela was taken aback by his words, though she could tell they were heartfelt. It was rare to hear such recognition from someone outside of her direct professional circle. The judge continued, "I realize that people in positions like mine, people who enforce the law, have a responsibility to recognize not just the law itself, but the human beings behind the cases. Your story, your work, it deserves to be heard." Angela leaned back in her chair, considering what he had said. "I appreciate that, Judge, and I think you're right. Sometimes, in our rush to process the system, we forget that people are more than just violations. They're individuals with lives, struggles, and aspirations. My work, my role in policy, is all about making sure that people are seen and heard, especially the ones who often go unnoticed. But that's not something you can always see from a courtroom." Judge Carter nodded, clearly reflecting on her words. "You've made me think about that. And I think there's a lesson here, not just for me, but for all of us who are involved in the legal system. The law should be a tool for justice, not just a mechanism for punishment. It should be about understanding the circumstances, the lives of those who come before us, and the changes they are trying to make in their communities. I've been too focused on the rules, and not enough on the people behind them." Angela smiled slightly, a mixture of surprise and relief washing over her. "It's not easy, Judge. We all have our roles to play. But if we're not open to learning from each other, we miss the opportunity to actually make the system work better." They sat in silence for a few moments, both of them considering the weight of the conversation. Angela realized that this meeting, one born from an unexpected moment of frustration, was beginning to bridge a gap between two worlds, one shaped by policy and the other by law. And it could potentially open up new avenues for collaboration and change. The judge spoke again, this time with a sense of resolve. "I think we need more of these kinds of conversations, not just in courtrooms, but everywhere. If we want to create real change, we have to see people as more than just cases. We have to listen." Angela nodded in agreement. "I couldn't have said it better myself, Judge." As they wrapped up their conversation, both of them felt a quiet sense of hope. There were no grand promises, no immediate solutions, but there was something more valuable. An understanding, a shared recognition of the power of listening and seeing beyond the surface. It was a conversation that mattered, and it was only the beginning. Weeks passed since Angela and Judge Carter's meeting, but the impact of their conversation lingered in both of their minds. For Angela, it had been a reminder of the power of dialogue. The simple act of being heard, truly heard, had shifted her perspective. While the system was far from perfect, there were still individuals within it who were open to change, willing to recognize that fairness meant more than following the rules rigidly. It meant understanding, listening, and, when necessary, stepping back to reassess. Angela returned to her work in Washington with a renewed sense of purpose. Her role as a policy strategist was demanding, but it wasn't just about drafting new laws or pushing for change. It was about engaging with people, building connections, and fostering an environment where empathy and accountability could coexist. She knew that her work wasn't just shaping the future of the country. It was also about reshaping the way people viewed justice, opportunity, and equality. One day, not long after their meeting, Angela received an unexpected email. It was from Judge Carter. His words were straightforward, but there was a sincerity in them that caught her attention. "I wanted to thank you once again for our conversation. Since we met, I've been rethinking a lot about how I approach my role as a judge. I've realized that the legal system isn't just about applying the law. It's about understanding the context, the individual, and the greater impact of each decision we make. I would like to invite you to be a guest speaker at an upcoming seminar for new judges. I think your perspective could be invaluable in helping them understand the importance of empathy and a holistic view of justice." Angela smiled as she read the email. This was more than just an apology. It was a recognition of the change that needed to happen. And it was a chance for her to continue pushing for a more compassionate approach within the very system that had once failed to recognize her. She replied with a warm acceptance, agreeing to speak at the seminar. The day of the seminar arrived, and Angela found herself standing before a room of eager young judges, all eager to learn and grow. As she shared her thoughts on policy, the importance of understanding the people behind the law, and the role empathy played in creating meaningful change, she could see the shift in their eyes. They were listening. And as she spoke, Angela realized that this was the kind of work that truly mattered, not just passing laws, but connecting with the people they affected. Judge Carter sat in the back of the room, watching with pride as Angela spoke. He had always believed in the power of learning from others, but now, seeing her speak, he felt the weight of his own transformation. It wasn't just his perspective that had shifted, it was the system itself. It was a slow, sometimes painful process, but it was happening. By the time Angela finished her talk, she felt a sense of fulfillment she hadn't expected. She knew that change, real change, was a slow process. But in that room, with Judge Carter and the new generation of judges listening, she saw the first seeds of a shift, one conversation, one decision, one person at a time. And for the first time in a long while, Angela felt hopeful about the future.